freedom is never gifted. It is seized, wrestled from the grip of those who would rather see others remain dependent. In Africa today, that struggle is no longer only about land, or gold, or oil. It is about the invisible highways of the 21st century, the digital arteries that carry knowledge, commerce, and power. For decades, every email, every payment, every search query from Accra to Nairobi was forced to travel across oceans before returning home. A continent of 1.4 billion people renting space on foreign networks, paying some of the highest costs in the world, only to be told that dependence was progress. Then came a voice, young yet unyielding. Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso stood before his people and declared that sovereignty is not a slogan, but a system, built into cables, into data, into destiny itself. Where others saw risk, he saw dignity. Where others predicted failure, he demanded freedom. The question now is not whether this struggle matters, but whether the world is ready for its consequences. Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map. Subscribe and keep watching, because this is not just a headline, it is a turning point. The architecture of Africa's digital life was, for decades, designed somewhere else. Every time a student in Nairobi downloaded a textbook, the request traveled thousands of miles to Europe or the United States before circling back. Every time a farmer in Ouagadougou checked crop prices, the signal first passed through foreign servers that acted as toll gates. The pattern was absurd yet inescapable, like mailing a letter to your next-door neighbor by first sending it across the Atlantic. This was not inefficiency by accident. It was a system of dependence written into code and cables. Africa, a continent of over 1.4 billion, carried some of the highest internet costs in the world. Families sacrificed a large portion of their income just to keep children connected for school. Businesses bled resources to foreign shareholders who controlled both the infrastructure and the flow of information. Meanwhile, the profits flowed outward, billions every year, extracted silently like minerals once were from beneath African soil. The indignity was not only financial. The very knowledge Africans searched for was filtered through foreign algorithms. A student looking for the Mali Empire often found more material on Napoleon. Local voices were buried, native languages sidelined, history itself rewritten by the architecture of the internet. Dependency was not just economic. It was cultural, intellectual, and psychological. Into this landscape stepped Ibrahim Traoré, then still in his mid-30s, new as the leader of Burkina Faso, but already uncompromising in his vision. He framed the issue not as technology, but as sovereignty. Sovereignty, he argued, must be comprehensive. It was not enough to hold political office, while the lifeblood of knowledge and communication was channeled through servers in distant capitals. Independence must run as deep as the fiber beneath the soil. He offered his people two paths. The first was safety in subordination. Africa could continue paying inflated fees to Silicon Valley, continue renting space on someone else's network, continue living within a digital system designed elsewhere. It was predictable, familiar, and guaranteed to preserve the hierarchy. The second path was dangerous, risk and freedom. It meant building Africa's own digital highways, over 100,000 kilometers of fiber optic cables, 47 new data centers, and a protocol deliberately incompatible with Silicon Valley's monopoly. The choice was stark: dependence disguised as stability, or sovereignty carved out with risk. Traoré knew what the safer option was, and he rejected it. He called on engineers, policymakers, and youth across the continent to imagine a network that was truly African, a network rooted in local realities and local languages, one that would no longer force every byte of data to beg for permission abroad. The initiative soon became continental. The African Union embraced the vision, branding it the Continental Internet Exchange. Critics in Washington and Paris called it symbolic, destined to fail. Analysts predicted delays, technical breakdowns, even chaos. Tech giants lobbied quietly, warning African governments that separation would mean isolation. Yet beneath the doubts, cables were laid across deserts and jungles. Data centers rose in Dakar, Lagos, Nairobi, and Ouagadougou. It was an audacious gamble, billions of dollars in investment, fragile infrastructure, and relentless external pressure. And still, the dream gathered momentum. Ordinary Africans, long accustomed to slow and costly connections, began to speak of the coming change with anticipation. Hashtags hinted at sovereignty. Murals appeared with slogans like, "Our data, our destiny." For once, hope traveled faster than fear. But a question lingered over every kilometer of cable, every server installed, every speech Traore delivered. Could Africa truly break free from the architecture of dependency? Could a continent long cast as a consumer become the architect of its own digital age? And as the switch neared completion, the world watched with unease. For everyone knew that once the cables lit up, nothing would be the same again. The moment of truth arrived like a thunderclap. When the switch was flipped, the invisible arteries of Africa pulsed with a new rhythm. Within days, over 200 million people migrated to the continental network. No platform in Silicon Valley's history, not Facebook, not TikTok, not WhatsApp, had ever witnessed such a surge so quickly. In Nairobi, students streamed lectures without interruption for the first time. In Lagos, businesses rejoiced as digital payments no longer detoured through Europe. In Ouagadougou, journalists searched in local languages and found African voices first, not buried under Western summaries. What had once been dismissed as symbolic suddenly became undeniable reality. Silicon Valley reeled. Emergency meetings were called at Google and Microsoft. Their systems could not penetrate the new network. The protocol had been designed to be incompatible, breaking the monopoly at its root. Crawlers could not index it. Cloud services could not dominate it. The very architecture that had preserved their dominance for decades had been bypassed overnight. Across the Atlantic, the political tremors began. In Washington, lawmakers debated whether sanctions should be imposed under the banner of digital security. Some called it reckless fragmentation, others a dangerous precedent for global stability. The language of concern barely concealed the fear of lost influence. In Paris and London, anxiety ran deep. For decades, control over information had been a hidden lever of soft power. Suddenly, that lever was gone. The media framed it as chaos, a splintering of the internet, a threat to global order. Headlines warned of instability, while television pundits asked if Africa was ready to manage such responsibility. Yet on the ground, Africans experienced not instability, but liberation. A family in Burkina Faso no longer had to choose between groceries and internet fees. Doctors in rural clinics exchanged patient data without foreign surveillance. Farmers used mobile apps built by neighbors, not faceless corporations oceans away. The emotional impact was as profound as the technical one. For young Africans, this was not abstract policy, but lived reality. It meant being seen, heard, and valued. It meant that their history appeared first in search results, their languages prioritized, their creativity amplified. The sense of dignity, long eroded by invisible systems of dependency, began to return. Traore's speeches became rallying cries, shared across social media in snippets and hashtags. His declaration, "Dependence ends the day we decide it ends," spread like wildfire. On university walls, in street murals, in viral clips, the message resonated. Sovereignty was no longer just a dream. It was infrastructure, fiber, and code. But victory brought new enemies. Lobbyists from Silicon Valley intensified pressure on African governments, warning of economic consequences. Western analysts predicted collapse under the weight of billions of transactions. Questions lingered. Could local engineers maintain the network? Could policymakers resist corruption and temptation? Would civil society be strong enough to prevent abuse of this newfound power? Despite the doubts, the benefits multiplied. Businesses saved billions. Schools flourished with affordable access, and startups bloomed in capitals once sidelined in the digital economy. Hope spread faster than fear, but resistance was not gone. For every African celebrating, a policymaker in Washington or Paris worried that this was not just a regional project, it was the first fracture in a world order long taken for granted. The tension thickened because the stakes were no longer confined to technology. This was about power. Who controlled knowledge? Who defined narratives? Who reaped the wealth of a connected world? The answers, for the first time, were shifting. And as Silicon Valley scrambled and Western capitals deliberated, a new question hung in the air. Would the shockwaves end at Africa's borders or ignite something far larger? The launch of Africa's own digital highways did more than disrupt Silicon Valley. It began reshaping life at every level of society. For decades, Africans had been told that independence in the digital realm was impossible, too costly, too complex. Yet when the cables lit up and the servers came online, the results were immediate and transformative. Economically, the numbers spoke for themselves. The $50 billion that once drained out of Africa each year for foreign digital services now circulated within local economies. Every dollar spent on connectivity became a seed planted in African soil, employing engineers, funding startups, and sustaining small businesses. In Lagos, entrepreneurs spoke of transactions that once cost days and dollars, now clearing instantly at a fraction of the price. In Nairobi, new incubators emerged, using the network as fertile ground for innovation. Africa was no longer paying rent to digital landlords. It was building equity in its own future. The cultural impact was equally profound. For too long, African voices had been buried beneath foreign algorithms. Search results on the Mali Empire, for instance, yielded more about Napoleon than about Africa's own civilizations. With the new protocol, this architecture of dependency was overturned. African history, oral traditions digitized, native languages prioritized. These were no longer hidden at the margins, but placed at the center. Students began to see themselves reflected in the knowledge they consumed. Teachers found resources that spoke their languages. For the first time, the internet in Africa felt like it belonged to Africa. At the political level, sovereignty gained a new dimension. Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just a young head of state. He was becoming a symbol. His speeches, once dismissed as radical, now carried the weight of evidence. The phrase Ibrahim Traoré legacy began to circulate, suggesting that what he had set in motion was larger than any single administration. It was not about one leader, but about the foundations of dignity embedded into fiber and code. But with every victory came new challenges. Civil society organizations raised concerns that sovereignty should not become a tool of repression. If the new network was to represent freedom, it had to protect dissent, not silence it. The balance between independence and liberty, between control and openness, became the next battleground. In Ouagadougou, activists warned that replacing one form of dependency with another, foreign or domestic, would betray the very spirit of the revolution. Internationally, the political consequences rippled outward. Washington and Paris continued to frame the move as destabilizing, fearful of losing leverage. Within Africa, however, pride swelled. From Dakar to Johannesburg, murals proclaimed "Our data, our destiny." Hashtags trended not just as slogans, but as declarations of identity. For once, the continent was not defined by dependency, but by initiative. Still, skeptics remained. Could local infrastructure handle billions of daily transactions? Could fragile economies sustain such rapid transformation? Could the unity required for a continental system withstand national rivalries? These questions loomed large, and they would determine whether the project remained a breakthrough or became a fleeting moment. And yet, beneath the doubts, something irreversible had begun. The architecture of dependency had been cracked. The idea that Africa must forever be a tenant in someone else's digital empire was no longer unchallenged. A seed of confidence had been planted, and it was already sprouting in classrooms, markets, and homes. But could this legacy withstand both the pressure of foreign powers and the temptation of domestic misuse? The answer would shape not only the future of Traore's generation, but the destiny of Africa itself. The tremors of Africa's digital revolution did not stop at its shores. They rippled outward, unsettling old alliances, challenging established powers, and inspiring distant observers. What began as a bold gamble in Ouagadougou quickly became a global debate about sovereignty, technology, and the future of the Internet. In Washington, policymakers wrestled with uncomfortable questions. For decades, the United States had positioned itself as the custodian of global digital infrastructure. Its corporations were the gatekeepers of knowledge, its networks, the conduits of global communication. Now, that dominance had been challenged not by another superpower, but by a continent long dismissed as dependent. Some voices called for sanctions, branding the African initiative as a threat to digital security. Others feared that punishing Africa would only accelerate the rise of regional alternatives. The mood was anxious, the consensus fractured. Paris and London viewed the development through a different lens, one of cultural influence. For centuries, narratives about Africa had been shaped, edited, and distributed from European capitals. With the rise of a sovereign African internet, that influence weakened. The ability to define how African history was told, which voices were amplified, and which stories reached the world was no longer guaranteed. Behind diplomatic language lay a deep fear, the erosion of cultural dominance. Yet while Western capitals fretted, elsewhere curiosity turned into admiration. In South America, leaders studied the African model, exploring whether a continental exchange of their own could shield them from foreign monopolies. In Asia, governments already experimenting with regional systems found validation in Africa's boldness. The precedent was clear. If Africa could build sovereignty at this scale, others could too. Global media reflected the divide. Western outlets often framed the move as reckless, warning of internet fragmentation. But independent voices, especially in the global South, celebrated it as a long overdue correction. Analysts noted that Africa's adoption curve, 200 million users in days, was unprecedented, a feat even Silicon Valley giants had never achieved. The message was unmistakable. Africans had not been loyal to Western platforms out of preference, but out of lack of choice. Given an alternative, they walked away. Within Africa, the international reaction only strengthened the sense of pride. The hashtags that spread across social media, Africa Connected, Sovereignty Now, Traore Vision, were no longer just slogans. They became a mirror, reflecting a continent ready to stand on its own terms. And for many, this was not only about the present, it was about the horizon ahead, the possibility of an Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, a future in which Africa does not simply participate in global systems, but architects them. But the question remained, was this digital revolution merely a local storm, or the dawn of a new multipolar internet? The cables have been laid, the data centers stand, and the switch has been flipped. Yet the journey is only beginning. Africa has entered uncharted territory, where sovereignty is no longer an aspiration, but a responsibility. The road ahead is filled with both peril and promise. On one side lies risk. Powerful interests abroad will not quietly accept the loss of influence. Lobbyists in Silicon Valley, policymakers in Washington, diplomats in Paris, all are searching for ways to reassert control. Pressure may come through sanctions, through trade agreements, or through narratives designed to sow doubt. The continent must brace itself for retaliation that could be subtle or severe. On the other side lies temptation from within. Sovereignty can empower, but it can also corrupt. Civil society warns that new digital control must not be wielded as a tool to silence dissent or centralize power unchecked. To succeed, Africa's revolution must pair independence with liberty, building a network that is both sovereign and democratic. If freedom becomes domination, the promise will wither. Yet beyond these challenges gleams opportunity. With infrastructure in its own hands, Africa can imagine a future shaped not by dependency, but by design. Faster, cheaper internet can fuel intra-African trade, enable telemedicine for rural clinics, and transform education across a continent where the median age is under 20. Startups can thrive, creating jobs and innovation rooted in local realities. The digital highways are more than cables. They are arteries carrying the lifeblood of a new economy. For Ibrahim Traoré, the task is to sustain momentum while avoiding the pitfalls of triumph. His legacy will not be judged only by the act of breaking free, but by the durability of what follows. Can this network endure for decades? Can it expand without fracturing? Can it embody dignity without replicating domination? These are questions that no single leader can answer, but which every African citizen will shape. What is certain is that the old order has been unsettled. The architecture of dependency has been cracked, and with it, the assumption that Africa must always be a tenant in someone else's digital empire. The road ahead may be long, but its direction is irreversible. And as the continent steps forward, the world cannot look away. For the struggle of Africa's digital sovereignty is no longer just its own, but a chapter in the story of our shared future. History does not always announce its turning points with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the hum of a data center, in the glow of fiber cables beneath the soil, in the determined words of a leader who refuses to bow. For Africa, this moment is such a turning point. From dependency to dignity, from subordination to sovereignty, the story of a continent reclaiming its digital lifelines has begun. No longer is Africa merely a tenant in someone else's empire of code. It is an architect in its own right, shaping the structures through which knowledge, trade, and power will flow. This is the foundation of the Ibrahim Traoré legacy. Not only political speeches, but fiber and servers, real and tangible, standing as monuments to a generation's refusal to inherit chains disguised as contracts. The question now stretches beyond Ouagadougou or Nairobi. If Africa can reclaim its digital sovereignty, why not others? In an age where pandemics, cyber attacks, and financial shocks expose the fragility of dependence, what does freedom mean for the rest of the world? Perhaps this is what the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050 gestures towards, a future where continents shape their own systems, not in isolation, but in balance, where dignity is coded into the very architecture of life. For centuries, Africa's wealth flowed outward: gold, cocoa, oil, and even the invisible wealth of data. Today, that flow is beginning to reverse. And as it does, the world must reckon with a truth long ignored. Sovereignty is not a threat, it is a right. If one small, landlocked nation can chart this path, what stops the rest of the world from doing the same? Do not let this moment pass unnoticed. Share the story. Let it travel further than any cable. Add your voice in the comments so that history is written not just by leaders, but by witnesses. And if you wish to walk with us through the next chapters of courage, sovereignty, and hope, subscribe now, because the journey of freedom has only just begun.